Let's talk about something that confuses a lot of people. When someone pulls away, disappears emotionally or physically, and then comes back. This speech is for those of you who have tangled with an avoidant, someone who craves connection but fears it at the same time. And if you've ever wondered, why did they leave and what are they thinking before they come back? You're not crazy, but you're also asking the wrong question. The better question is, what is going on internally for them before they choose to reconnect? Avoidants don't just wake up one day and say, I miss them. Let me go fix this. That's not how it works. Reconnection for them is not driven by clarity, it's driven by discomfort. So here's what they actually think before reaching out again. Avoidants often operate from a place of emotional self-protection. When they consider reconnecting, it's not usually because they've get a grand realization about how much they love or miss someone. It starts with a shift in how safe they feel, internally and externally. Their fear of emotional entanglement can be paralyzing. Connection triggers a part of them that equates closeness with vulnerability and vulnerability with danger. So when they initially disconnect, it's not always a sign that something went wrong in the relationship. Sometimes things were actually going really well. Too well. That emotional intimacy can spark their internal alarm system. When they consider coming back, it's not necessarily because they think everything has been sorted out or that they've healed. It's often because they feel less emotionally overwhelmed than they did before. That safe enough feeling may come from time and space away from the intensity of the connection. Distance gives them room to breathe, to reset their internal emotional balance, and to detach from the pressure they felt when things got too close. It might not be that the relationship dynamic has changed, but their anxiety about it has lowered. That decrease in anxiety gives them the illusion that they're now ready to re-engage, even if the core issues are still unresolved. What many people don't realize is that avoidants crave connection too. They want to be loved, they want closeness, but they also fear what that closeness might cost them emotionally. So this inner conflict, desire versus fear, creates a kind of emotional seesaw. When the fear outweighs the desire, they pull away, but when the fear quiets down, the desire starts to rise again. That's often the tipping point when they reach out. It's not necessarily a sign of deep introspection or growth. Sometimes it's simply that the volume of their internal fear has turned down temporarily. In this moment, they're assessing whether the situation feels safe enough to return to. They might ask themselves if you're likely to be forgiving, if the emotional atmosphere will be calm, or if they can re-enter without immediately confronting everything that caused them to leave in the first place. It's a calculation of comfort more than commitment. The problem is if they return just because things feel less threatening, not because they've faced their fears, then the cycle is likely to repeat. And if you're unaware of this pattern, it's easy to misread their return as emotional readiness when it's really just emotional relief. When an avoidant person thinks about reconnecting, one of the most powerful internal drivers isn't love or clarity, it's fear of loss, specifically the fear of losing access to you. There's a key difference between missing someone in a way that reflects true emotional intimacy and feeling panic at the idea that they might no longer be there. Avoidants are often not in tune with the depth of their own emotions, but they are deeply sensitive to the threat of something being taken away from them. That fear doesn't necessarily mean they're ready to step into a relationship wholeheartedly. It just means they're starting to feel the discomfort of disconnection. Avoidants often pull away when they start to feel overwhelmed, smothered, or overly exposed. At the time of distancing, they might even convince themselves they're better off alone. But as time passes, something starts to shift. You stop reaching out. You stop checking in. The space they once craved becomes quieter and then eerily silent. That silence to someone who is avoidant starts to feel like loss. Not in the relational sense, but in the possession sense. They realize that they might not be able to get your attention anymore, that they might have truly disconnected from someone who once made them feel wanted. And this, more than anything, can trigger the urge to reconnect. It's important to understand that this doesn't always come from a healthy place. The desire to avoid losing you might not reflect an understanding of your value or a readiness to build something real. Sometimes it's about avoiding regret, about not wanting to deal with the emotional consequences of knowing they let something slip through their fingers. They want to hold on to the option of you, even if they're still not ready to fully choose you. That's why some people say avoidance, come back just to make sure you're still there. It's about reassurance, not resolution. What they fear losing isn't just the relationship, it's the emotional safety net, the ability to return when they want, the knowledge that they still have some emotional hold. That fear of losing access can become so uncomfortable that reaching out feels like the only way to get relief. They don't want to close the door entirely, even if they aren't ready to fully walk back through it. So they hover, they test the waters. They reach out not necessarily to repair, but to make sure the bridge hasn't burned completely. When an avoidant person starts thinking about reconnecting, one of the first things they assess is whether they can do so without being met with emotional intensity. They are not just wondering how you feel, they are scanning for signs of potential confrontation, vulnerability, or accountability that might be waiting for them on the other side of that message or call. Avoidants are conflict averse, but not in the typical sense. It's not just arguments they want to avoid, it's emotional exposure. The idea of being asked to explain their actions, express their feelings, or commit to something deeper triggers the very discomfort that made them pull away in the first place. Before reaching out, they run through a mental checklist. Will you be angry? Will you demand answers? Will you ask them to talk about feelings they've spent energy suppressing? If the emotional risk feels too high, they often delay reconnecting, even if they feel a desire to do so. That's why you may experience long silences, random reappearances, or low effort check-ins. These are not always attempts to reignite the relationship. They are often tests, subtle probes to gauge the emotional temperature. If they sense warmth and openness without pressure, they might inch closer. If they detect heat, like resentment, expectation, or emotional demands, they are likely to retreat again. This is why so many avoidants seem to prefer situations where they can slide back into your life casually. A funny meme, a just checking in text, or a reaction to your story on social media. It's a way of re-establishing presence without stepping into emotional responsibility. They're not necessarily ready to rebuild trust or repair what was broken. What they want is to be let back in without having to acknowledge what happened while they were gone. This avoidance of emotional confrontation is also rooted in fear. Fear of being overwhelmed, fear of not having the right answers, and fear of being seen as flawed. To them, vulnerability is not just difficult, it feels unsafe. If they believe reconnecting will mean entering a space where they are expected to open up or be accountable, they might choose silence instead. But if they think they can re-enter the relationship without much emotional friction, they're far more likely to test the waters. In the avoidant mind, reconnection is not just about desire, it's a risk assessment. And unless they believe they can do it without being emotionally cornered, they may continue to stay distant, even if they still care. When avoidants consider reconnecting, they often go through a process of mentally revising the past. This isn't necessarily intentional or manipulative. It's a psychological defense mechanism that helps them reduce the discomfort they feel about how things ended. Emotional distance creates mental distance, and with that space comes the opportunity to reshape what happened in a way that feels more tolerable to them. The longer they're away, the more likely they are to downplay their role in the disconnection or reframe the experience in a way that makes them feel less guilty or vulnerable. They may start to question whether the breakup or the emotional distance was as serious as it felt at the time. In their minds, the reasons for pulling away become softened or even justified. They might tell themselves that you were being too emotional, too needy, or overreacting. That narrative becomes a shield, allowing them to avoid facing the deeper truths of their behavior or the pain they may have caused. This internal story makes it easier for them to consider reaching out without first doing the emotional work of taking responsibility. Avoidants are often uncomfortable with guilt and accountability. Instead of sitting in those feelings, they subconsciously rewrite events to make themselves feel more in control and less at fault. This narrative isn't always malicious. It's a coping strategy. By minimizing what happened, they reduce the emotional weight of re-engagement. If they convince themselves that things weren't that bad, then reaching out doesn't feel like a major emotional risk. It feels casual, even reasonable. This rewriting also helps them avoid the vulnerability required for real reconnection. If they were to acknowledge the full impact of their withdrawal, they would have to face not only your pain, but also their own discomfort with intimacy. So instead, they create a version of the past where their actions were understandable, your reactions were exaggerated, and the entire situation was less intense than it really was. This becomes especially confusing for the person on the receiving end. You may remember long nights of crying, conversations that left you feeling abandoned, or moments when you were vulnerable and met with silence. Yet when the avoidant returns, they act as though things ended on a vague or neutral note. That mismatch between your emotional reality and their revised narrative can leave you questioning your own experience. It's not that they don't remember, it's that they've reshaped the memory into something that feels easier to return to. When an avoidant starts thinking about reconnecting, a question often lingers quietly in the background of their mind. Can I feel wanted again without having to give too much of myself? At the core of this thought is a complex tension between their desire for closeness and their fear of emotional obligation. Avoidants aren't emotionless. They often long to feel connection, affection, and intimacy, but they want those things in a way that doesn't threaten their sense of independence or overwhelm their nervous system. This internal contradiction creates a kind of emotional push-pull dynamic where they want to be close, just enough to feel significant, but not so close that they feel exposed. Reaching out after a period of distance is sometimes more about satisfying this internal craving for validation than about building something real. They want to know they're still missed. They want to feel like someone still cares. In fact, the act of being wanted, of being received warmly after silence or absence, becomes its own form of reassurance. It tells them they still matter, that they haven't ruined everything, and that they still have access to comfort on their terms. The moment that connection starts to ask something of them, clarity, consistency, or emotional availability, they may start pulling back again. This is why reconnecting with an avoidant can feel so confusing. They may say the right things, show up just enough to give hope, and express a level of interest that looks promising. But if you look closely, the emotional investment often remains shallow. They aren't necessarily inviting you into a deeper emotional bond. They're testing whether they can feel close without feeling trapped. And if the reconnection begins to threaten that sense of autonomy, they may retreat again, leaving you with a sense of emotional whiplash. The problem isn't that they don't care at all. It's that they're trying to get emotional needs met without stepping into emotional accountability. They want the benefit of love, the warmth, the ego boost, the intimacy, without the vulnerability and discomfort that real connection requires. Unless they've done some genuine inner work, their return is often an attempt to manage their own emotional discomfort rather than to repair or rebuild something with you. This cycle can repeat unless both people are aware of what's happening. If you're not paying attention, you might interpret their return as readiness, when in reality, it's a temporary reach for comfort that isn't backed by real change. So, what avoidants think before they decide to reconnect? Always what we hope they're thinking. It's not necessarily a sign of clarity, change, or commitment. It's often a reflection of their own emotional temperature and discomfort. Reconnection may be driven by fear of loss, a need for reassurance, or a momentary drop in anxiety, not a full understanding of the relationship or their role in it. That doesn't mean their feelings are fake. It means their actions are filtered through layers of fear, avoidance, and self-protection. Understanding this can help you take their return less personally and respond from a place of strength, not confusion. If someone is coming back into your life, ask yourself, are they ready to step forward with intention? Or are they just trying to make sure I haven't walked away? You deserve more than a connection that's based on fear, control, or momentary comfort. You deserve something mutual, grounded, and emotionally safe. Thank you for giving me your time and attention today. If this resonated with you, I hope it offered not just clarity, but calm. You're not alone in navigating these dynamics, and you're not crazy for wanting answers. Just remember, your peace is not negotiable. Guard it well. Take care of yourself, and thank you for being here.